You guys know that we love tier lists here on this channel. In today's video, we're going to be ranking the offense of every single team in the league from D tier all the way up to S tier. We begin all the way down to the bottom, the teams that I think have the worst offenses in the league as of right now. And we have to begin that tier, in my opinion, with Utah Jazz. They're not trying particularly hard to have a good offense this year. They've already traded away guys like Bogdanovich. Of course, Donovan Mitchell's gone. Gobert is gone. And I mean, Jordan Clarkson is going to put up some points. You know, Mike Conley, if he's still there. But I would venture to guess that most of the usable veteran players on this roster are going to be moved within the next, 3 to 12 months. And ultimately, there's just nobody you're really counting on here to be exciting or interesting offensively. Next up is San Antonio. They have some interesting young players a little bit, but arguably are the least talented team in the entire league. I've said that before, and certainly that translates most to the offensive end of the floor. Maybe they'll be a little bit surprising and win like 35 games with a good defense and a team that really wants to play hard every night. But to me, those two teams are very clearly in the bottom tier and alone in the bottom tier of NBA offenses. We move on now to the C tier, and we begin it with the Indiana Pacers, a team that I actually think I'm going to end up watching a good amount this year because I want to see what Tyrese Halliburton looks like. They still have some interesting players on that roster, but there is not a single number one, probably even number two offensive option on this team unless it's Tyrese Halliburton. And typically when you see guys like that have to be the number one option, it doesn't go particularly well for their efficiency, and it's just kind of ugly basketball to watch. So to me, they're definitely in the C tier. Joining them in the C tier is the Orlando Magic. I want to have them higher than this. Cole Anthony is good. They've got Paolo Banchero, who they just drafted. Franz is good, but there's just this stereotype, right, of Orlando being one of the worst scoring teams in the league. They've been a bottom 10 scoring team for what feels like forever, and I'm just not quite ready to say that all of a sudden all these young guys are going to play really well. They're going to have a cohesive offensive unit. I'm hoping I'm wrong about this one, but I think they are in the second to lowest tier in terms of NBA offenses. There's some really, really good offenses in the league. Next up, Oklahoma City, another team that maybe might not be trying particularly hard, but their talent is certainly higher than teams like Utah and San Antonio, especially offensively. Shea, if he plays, is really good. Giddey is continuing to grow and develop. It would be nice if Chet was playing, but he's not. They have guys that can space the floor a little bit. They're going to play hard. But in terms of top tier offensive talent, they don't quite have enough to go up into the next tier. Next up now is Charlotte. They have LaMelo, and like we always say, not a whole lot else. Terry Rozier is fine. Gordon Hayward is fine, but it's not like they brought in anybody this offseason that is going to raise the ceiling of this group offensively. And unless LaMelo suddenly becomes like a Luka level player, they're certainly in the C tier for me. Next up, New York. Is anybody really excited about watching this team offensively this year? Like, Jalen Brunson's fine. I think RJ's good and improving. I don't think Julius Randle's a particularly fun player to watch offensively, and there's not really a whole lot else to speak of on this roster. I honestly think you could probably make an argument for them to be in the bottom tier if you want to, but I didn't do that. I put them in the C tier. And then last up in this tier is Washington, who has probably the best player in this tier in Bradley Beal, but just not a whole lot else. Like, the rest of this roster really brings it down. Obviously, if you have Beal and a couple of other, pretty competent offensive players, you're going to be certainly in the B tier at least. But Porzingis, you don't know if he's going to play. I'm not really that confident in his ability offensively. Kuzma's improved, but like Kyle Kuzma is my second best offensive player, is not all that exciting. And then the rest of the roster is really just random young guys that may or may not be good. So they're in the C tier. We move on now to the B tier. And as it always seems to be in these videos, the B tier has a lot of teams in it. We begin with the Detroit Pistons, a team that I think actually is going to be pretty good offensively this year because of three guys. It's going to be Jaden Ivey, it's going to be Cade Cunningham, and Sadiq Bey, who can really space the floor, is a good wing for them. And they've continued to add offensive options. Like, I think Bogdanovich helps. I think that they have a couple of interesting young guys, especially in the front court, that could really be consequential to their season. And overall, I believe in Cade's ability to run a high-level NBA offense with some better players around him now, and I think we're going to see that this season. I have them in the B tier, which maybe is higher than some other people would. Next up in the tier, I have the Toronto Raptors, a team that I think in general is a very good basketball team, but their calling card is more so on the defensive end of the floor, playing in transition. And even as good as, Siakam is and Van Vliet and Scotty Barnes is going to continue to get better, offensively, there's just not one of those like elite teams. And you'll see once we get to the A and E S tier here, why Toronto probably belongs more in the B tier, which is not a bad place to be considering how versatile they are on the other end of the floor. And they have a lot of different options. It's just top tier talent doesn't really exist here in Toronto in terms of, on the offensive end of the floor yet. Maybe Scotty Barnes will get there this year or the following. Next up now is Houston, who I do think has top tier talent. They're just a little bit young for me to put higher than this on this list. Jalen Green is fun. They've got a ton of guards. I think Jabari Smith is going to continue to show, the fact that he's just going to be really good during the regular season, contrary to the performances he put on at times in Summer League. But they're just a little bit too young for me. They're kind of in that Pistons area for me. That's why they're in the B tier. I also put the LA Lakers in the B tier, and I don't think this is all that controversial. I mean, if this team is going to be really good this year, it's going to be based off the 2020 bubble formula, right? Like, they're going to be incredible defensively. They're going to be good in transition. They're going to rebound the ball. And that 2020 bubble team, with the exception of in the bubble when they started shooting threes well, was not a very good offensive team. And then they started, playing well in the bubble, and obviously they win the title. But I don't think that there's a ton of offensive talent here outside outside of obviously LeBron and Anthony Davis, guys you don't know they're going to be healthy, and then the rust fit is always questionable. Maybe this will change if they change up the roster, but for right now, I think they're in the B tier. Also in the B tier, Sacramento. I think you could make the case for them to be in the A tier, honestly, with the way that De'Aaron Fox played towards the end of last year. They've got him. Obviously, they have Sabonis, Malik Monk. Like, they've got Kevin Huerter. They've got a lot of guys on this roster that offensively, at least, they might not be the best defensive team in the league, but offensively, they're really exciting and they're really interesting. I couldn't quite put them in the A tier. Again, when you see those other teams, it'll make more sense. But for right now, I'm going to put them in the B tier. Next up now, the Boston Celtics. Again, this maybe feels a little bit out of place. I thought about putting them in the A tier, but again, the offense is not really what makes this team go. They're an incredible defensive team, and their offense really plays off that. And individual talent-wise, Tatum, Brown, like they're going to be improved with Malcolm Brogdon on the floor if he's healthy. But strictly from an offensive standpoint, I think they are in the B tier. Next up, Miami, kind of a similar thing. Tyler Hero, congrats on your new extension. Jimmy Butler, Kyle Lowry if he's healthy, bam. But these are all versatile, like two-way guys with the exception of Tyler Hero. And when you're looking at top half of the league or top 10 offenses in the league, I don't think Miami is there. Next up, Cleveland, another team that I wanted to put higher, but I didn't want to get too excited about the Garland-Mitchell combo before we've even seen it. And we still need to figure out exactly how Mobley and Allen are going to fit alongside those two guys, and especially the wing spot as well. I think spacing could be a real issue off the ball for Cleveland when either Mitchell or Garland has the ball and the only other spacer is the other player between those two on the floor, or if it's just one of them on the floor, I think spacing could be an issue, which to me bumps them down a little bit. Three more teams now in this tier. I have Portland as well. I just don't know what we're getting from Dame at this point after the rough season last year with the injury and everything. I like Anthony Simons. I like some of the additions that they made this past offseason, but I'm not ready to put them in the A tier. Minnesota also in this tier. I love Anthony Edwards. D'Angelo Russell feels like a weird fit. Cat's incredible. It's kind of like Cleveland. Like, I'm just going to struggle to put a team like this that's running two bigs all the time in a top tier offensive category. It might make them a better team overall to be that good defensively and just be pretty good offensively, but to put them in the A tier, to me, it just doesn't really make any sense. And then last up in this tier is the Clippers. Now, I had to kind of go against I wouldn't say bias, but I really like the Clippers this year, and I think in terms of an overall team, they're going to be really good. They have a ton of depth, but right now, offensively, coming off of the injuries to Paul George and Kawhi Leonard and ttrying to figure out the entirety of the roster, certainly there's a ton of talent there for them to be an A tier offensive team, but right now, to me, they feel a little bit more like a really deep team that's going to, be able to play in a lot of different ways and be really good defensively rather than some kind of juggernaut offensive team. Then we move on to the A and the S tiers. There's actually a lot of teams in these two categories because I think there's a lot of really good offensive teams. These are basically, in my opinion, the top 10 offenses in the league going into this season. We begin the A tier with the Atlanta Hawks. Now, spoiler alert, the Mavs are in the S tier, and the reason is pretty much just because I think Luka's better than Trae, but that's a conversation for a different day and a conversation that I'm sure some of you are already, seen me have on the channel. Atlanta, it's DeJounte Murray, it's Trae Young, and it's other guys, right? Like John Collins, some Clint Capella rim runs, some guys on the perimeter trying to create and space off the ball, but it's all about how well Trae Young and DeJounte Murray play together. And even though I'm skeptical about that fit, Trae Young can't be, just based off how good he is offensively and the way that he's carried this team offensively in the past, he can't be lower than the A tier in my opinion. Next up, Chicago, a team that I considered putting in the B tier, but when you think about how good DeMar was last year and how incredible of an offensive player Zach LaVine is, I think that they're going to be a pretty good offensive team. Defensively, I have a ton of questions, but I'm willing to put them in one of the top 10 offenses in the league. Next up is Phoenix. If you want to tell me Phoenix wins like 45 games this year and Chris Paul's hurt, like I believe you, but right now, just given how efficient they were last year offensively, I really can't bump them down lower than A. They're going to have their issues this year, but I think offensively at least, they're still going to be a really good team with the amount of talent that they have and how well they play together, at least last year. So I'm going to put them in the A tier. And then last up in the A tier, I have Memphis, who I think a lot of people traditionally think about as this like deep defensive team, which is true, but all that transition stuff, like that counts. That's still offense. And Ja is incredible. And Desmond Bane is really good. And they have all these different options on the wings. They're going to continue to improve as a shooting team as well. I really like Memphis as an offensive team. It's a team that I don't really want to play against defensively. And so I'm going to put them in the A tier. And then we go to the top tier, the S tier. And I begin the tier with the Brooklyn Nets. You can tell me I'm crazy. You can tell me that, I'm a biased Nets fan. That's fine. But you can't tell me that on paper, this is not one of the best offensive teams in the league. It's one of the things that makes them at least a half decent team because defensively, they have really never been good in the entirety of the time that KD and Kyrie have been there. But offensively, between, the way all these different pieces fit together, I think they can certainly be one of the best offenses in the league. Next up in this tier, I have Denver, again, depending on the injury return of guys like Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., but it's kind of like the Trae Young thing. Like, I can't really have Nikola Jokic low on this list. And to me, given some of the guys they're bringing back and the better fit along this roster around Jokic, I'm going to put them in the S tier. There's a very clear theme, by the way, of all the teams pretty much in the A and the S tier, with maybe an exception if you want to make one. They all have at least one, and a lot of the times two, really, really good, outstanding offensive players. We move on now in the S tier. Speaking of that, to Dallas. I talked about them earlier. It's Luka. Like, Luka is arguably the most efficient, best individual engine of a high-level NBA offense that we have in the league right now. And the only reason that I wouldn't consider them literally the top offense in the league is because of the pieces they have around them and maybe a lack of spacing, obviously losing Jalen Brunson. But Luka alone, I think, is enough to put this team in the S tier. Next up now, Milwaukee. Pretty much the same thing with Giannis, but of course the surrounding cast is better. Chris Middleton, Drew Holiday, when healthy, are still very good offensive players. They have plenty of spacing. Bobby Portis, things like that. They know how they play, and they're, to me, certainly a top-level offense. Next up now as well, I have Philadelphia, Harden, Maxey, Tobias Harris, PJ Tucker knocking down corner threes, and then of course Joel Embiid. Pretty much the entirety of the S tier, as you can tell, is like these teams have have MVP caliber players on the roster, and it's just really, really hard to see how some of the 5 or 6 best offensive players in the league aren't on one of the 5 or 6 best offenses in the entire league. Then last up to finish out the list is the Golden State Warriors. I actually considered putting them in the A tier because of how Steph-centric they can be at times, and they're not what they were certainly at their peak, but I don't want to penalize them for that. It's still Steph, it's still Clay, it's still Draymond doing Draymond stuff, and they still are going to find a way. And then you have, Jordan Poole, you have all these wings, you have Wiggins, like they're still going to be a very good offensive team, and so I put them in that tier as well. Let me know down in the comment section below which teams you disagreed with the most, where you would have put some of your favorite teams. Let me know down in the comment section below. It's one of my favorite things about doing these rankings videos is seeing y'all's opinions afterwards. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.